The seeds of World War II were firmly planted in the turbulent aftermath of World War I. The war, which ended in November 1918 with the defeat of the Central Powers, left much of Europe politically shattered, economically drained, and socially traumatized. Among the many attempts to build a lasting peace, none was more influential or controversial than the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919. The treaty, instead of promoting reconciliation, served as a catalyst for resentment, especially in Germany, and helped shape the conditions that led to the outbreak of another global conflict just 2 decades later. The Treaty of Versailles was the central peace settlement between the Allied powers and Germany. Signed on June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the treaty imposed a series of harsh political, territorial, military, and economic conditions on Germany. The most controversial and humiliating of these were loss of territory. Germany was stripped of approximately 13% of its pre-war territory and all of its overseas colonies. Notable territorial losses included the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France, the creation of the Polish Corridor, the establishment of Danzig as a free city, and the loss of Eupen-Malmedy to Belgium. In addition, Schleswig was returned to Denmark, and Saar-Basin was placed under the administration of the League of Nations. Disarmament. The treaty severely limited the size and capacity of Germany's military. The German army was restricted to 100,000 men. Conscription was banned, and it was forbidden to possess tanks, heavy artillery, submarines, or an air force. The Rhineland, a crucial region bordering France, was to be demilitarized, acting as a buffer zone to protect France from future German aggression. War reparations. Germany was ordered to pay 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars today, in reparations to the Allied nations. These payments were meant to cover war damages, but ultimately became a symbol of humiliation and a significant strain on the German economy. War Guilt Clause, Article 231. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging clause, Article 231 forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. This clause justified the reparations, but was widely resented by Germans across the political spectrum. The Weimar Republic, founded in 1919, was Germany's first experiment with parliamentary democracy. However, the Republic was born in crisis and faced fierce opposition from both the extreme left, communists, and the extreme right, nationalists and fascists. The early 1920s witnessed violent political unrest, including the Spartacist Uprising, 1919, led by communist revolutionaries Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. The Kapp Putsch, 1920, a right-wing coup attempt by disaffected army officers. Numerous assassinations of politicians and government officials. Into this chaotic environment stepped radical political movements. Among them, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or Nazi Party, gained traction by exploiting public dissatisfaction. Led by Adolf Hitler, the party promised to restore German pride, reject the Versailles Treaty, fight communism, and rebuild the economy. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Europe was becoming increasingly polarized. Germany's grievances remained unaddressed. The global economy was in freefall, and nationalist and authoritarian movements were rising across the continent. In this volatile climate, Adolf Hitler's message of national revival, racial purity, and revenge found a receptive audience. As the Weimar Republic collapsed under economic and political strain, the Nazi Party surged in popularity. By 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, marking the beginning of a new era, one that would soon plunge the world back into war. The aftermath of World War I left much of the world politically destabilized and economically shattered. As liberal democracies struggled to recover, a new wave of authoritarian ideologies rose across Europe and Asia, promising order, national rejuvenation, and strength. These ideologies, fascism, militarism, and communism, manifested in regimes that centralized power, suppressed dissent, and pursued aggressive foreign policies. The failure of democratic governments and the ineffectiveness of international peacekeeping organizations, like the League of Nations, allowed these totalitarian regimes to flourish. Germany's defeat in World War I, followed by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, left the nation politically humiliated, economically crippled, and socially fragmented. The Weimar Republic, established after the war, faced massive challenges. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s wiped out savings. The Great Depression, 1929, triggered mass unemployment. Political extremism, from both the far left and far right, flourished. Amid this chaos, Adolf Hitler, a World War I veteran and leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party, gained popularity by channeling public frustration. He promised to restore German pride and overturn Versailles, rebuild the economy and provide jobs, promote Aryan supremacy while scapegoating Jews, communists, and others. In 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. After the Reichstag fire, he used emergency powers to dismantle democratic institutions. By 1934, with the death of President Hindenburg, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, becoming the Führer of Nazi Germany. He created a totalitarian regime built on propaganda, repression, cult of personality, and brutal suppression of opposition. In Italy, post-World War I economic crisis, social unrest, and dissatisfaction with the Versailles settlements laid the groundwork for fascism. Benito Mussolini, a former socialist turned nationalist, founded the Fascist Party in 1919. His ideology emphasized militarism and nationalism, anti-communism, authoritarian leadership, the supremacy of the state over the individual. In 1922, Mussolini's March on Rome pressured King Victor Emmanuel III to appoint him prime minister. Once in power, Mussolini systematically dismantled democratic institutions, banned political opposition, and established a corporatist state. His regime was marked by aggressive propaganda campaigns, the use of the black shirts, paramilitary thugs, suppression of dissent, ambitions to recreate a Roman-style empire. Beginning with the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, Mussolini coined the term totalitarianism, presenting his state as all-encompassing and unchallengeable. Japan's transition into militarism was influenced by several factors: economic hardship during the Global Depression, rising nationalism and distrust of Western powers, ambitions for territorial expansion to secure natural resources. By the early 1930s, the civilian government had been increasingly dominated by military leaders, especially the Imperial Japanese Army. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. The invasion was condemned internationally, but Japan withdrew from the League of Nations and continued its aggressive policies. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, leading to the Second Sino-Japanese War, marked by atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre. The Japanese military regime was driven by the belief in the divine status of the emperor, racial superiority, the creation of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, essentially an empire controlled by Japan. After the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, Russia transformed into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Under Joseph Stalin, who consolidated power by the late 1920s, the USSR became a totalitarian state marked by centralized planning and forced collectivization of agriculture, brutal repression, including the Great Purge, in which millions were executed, imprisoned, or exiled, censorship and propaganda, a massive network of labor camps, gulags. Despite its brutality, Stalin's regime rapidly industrialized the Soviet economy and built a powerful military. The USSR promoted a global communist revolution, supporting leftist movements abroad while ruthlessly eliminating internal dissent. From the moment Adolf Hitler took power in 1933, he pursued a policy of rebuilding Germany's military might in open violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which had imposed strict limits on the German military. Hitler withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. He began rearming the German military, increasing the size of the army, rebuilding the Luftwaffe, Air Force, and expanding the Navy. In 1935, Hitler announced the reintroduction of conscription, aiming for an army of 550,000 men, far above the Versailles limit of 100,000. Though these moves violated international agreements, the response from Britain and France was minimal. Britain even signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, 1935, allowing Germany to expand its navy to 35% of the Royal Navy's size, an act of appeasement that undermined collective resistance. Point. In March 1936, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone under the Versailles Treaty meant to act as a buffer between Germany and France. This was a bold and risky move. German forces were under strict orders to retreat if confronted by French troops. France, politically divided and unwilling to act without British support, did nothing. Britain viewed the move as a justified action within Germany's own borders. The remilitarization was a turning point. It marked the first major test of Allied resolve, and their failure to act convinced Hitler that they would not challenge further aggression. In March 1938, Hitler orchestrated the Anschluss, or union, with Austria, violating the Versailles and Saint-Germain treaties, which prohibited such a union. Austrian Nazis, supported by Hitler, destabilized the government. Under pressure, Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg called for a referendum, but Hitler responded by sending in troops. Austria was annexed without resistance, and a plebiscite held under Nazi control claimed overwhelming support for the Union. The international response was once again muted. The success of the Anschluss encouraged Hitler to pursue his next goal, the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland, a German-speaking region in Czechoslovakia, became the focus of Hitler's next territorial claim. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland be ceded to Germany, citing the self-determination of ethnic Germans. Tensions rose and war seemed imminent. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, along with French Premier Édouard Daladier, met Hitler in Munich to negotiate. The result was the Munich Agreement. Czechoslovakia was excluded from the talks. Britain and France agreed to let Hitler annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial demands. Chamberlain returned to Britain proclaiming, "Peace for our time." But Winston Churchill and others warned that this was merely appeasement of aggression, not peacekeeping. In March 1939, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, establishing the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. This conquest had no ethnic justification. It was an outright act of imperial expansion. The West realized Hitler could not be appeased. For the first time, Britain and France recognized that Hitler posed a serious threat to European stability. They guaranteed the independence of Poland, marking a major shift in policy. While tensions escalated in Europe, Hitler prepared for war with Poland. Fearing a war on two fronts, he sought an alliance with his ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. In August 1939, Germany and the USSR shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between the two nations. A secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would get Western Poland. The USSR would get Eastern Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia, part of Romania. From 1933 to 1939, Britain and France consistently tried to appease Hitler, believing that by making concessions, they could avoid another world war. This policy failed for several reasons. Hitler interpreted appeasement as weakness, not diplomacy. Each concession only increased Nazi power and ambition. Democratic leaders underestimated Hitler's goals. They believed he could be reasoned with. By the time the West realized the extent of Hitler's expansionist agenda, it was almost too late. The final straw came when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. The fall of France and the Battle of Britain, 1940. 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. May-June 1940, Germany bypassed the Maginot Line, invaded France through the Ardennes. France fell in 6 weeks. Vichy regime collaborated with Nazis. Britain stood alone. Battle of Britain, aerial war between the RAF and Luftwaffe. British victory prevented German invasion. Operation Barbarossa and the Eastern Front, June 22, 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. Goals: Lebensraum, defeat communism, control resources. Early successes for Germany, but the campaign bogged down. Sieges: Leningrad, 872-day blockade. Stalingrad, 1942–43. Turning point. Soviet victory marked the beginning of Nazi retreat. Eastern Front was the largest and bloodiest theater of war. War in the Pacific and the rise of Japan. 1931, Japan seized Manchuria. 1937, full invasion of China. Nanjing Massacre. 1940–41, Japan expanded into Indochina. December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. USA declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the US. Japan quickly conquered vast territories: Philippines, Indonesia, Burma. The Holocaust stands as one of the darkest and most horrifying chapters in human history. A state-sponsored, systematic campaign of extermination carried out by Nazi Germany. Rooted in racist and anti-Semitic ideology, the Holocaust resulted in the murder of over 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims the Nazi regime deemed undesirable. It was not only a genocide, but also a stark reminder of the consequences of hate, propaganda, indifference, and unchecked authoritarianism. After the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939, Jewish communities were forcibly segregated into urban ghettos, walled-in, overcrowded districts where disease and starvation were rampant. The Warsaw Ghetto, the largest, housed over 400,000 Jews in just 1.3 square miles. Ghettos were used as temporary holding areas before deportation to camps. Conditions were deliberately designed to cause death through neglect. Despite the horrors, many ghettos became centers of resistance and culture, with underground schools, religious gatherings, and even armed uprisings like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, 1943. Following the 1941 German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, the Nazis launched a new phase of mass murder through the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units composed of SS, police, and local collaborators. Their mission: mass executions of Jews, Roma, communists, and others behind the front lines. Victims were rounded up, forced to dig mass graves, and shot in open fields or forests. Major massacres included Babi Yar, Ukraine, where 33,771 Jews were murdered over 2 days in September 1941. By the end of 1941, hundreds of thousands had been killed in this manner. These actions demonstrated the Nazi shift from persecution to industrial-scale genocide. In January 1942, high-ranking Nazi officials met at the Wannsee Conference in Berlin to coordinate the final solution to the Jewish question: the plan to systematically exterminate all Jews in Europe. The conference, led by Reinhard Heydrich, formalized the logistics of genocide: mass deportations to killing centers, registration of Jews across occupied territories, coordination between various government ministries. The final solution marked the transition from shootings and starvation to organized mass murder in extermination camps. 6 major extermination camps were constructed in occupied Poland to implement the final solution. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most notorious, over 1.1 million murdered. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek, designed solely for killing. Victims were transported by rail in cattle cars, often unaware of their fate. Upon arrival, many were immediately gassed in chambers disguised as showers. Others were used for forced labor, medical experimentation, or simply worked to death. Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, was used at Auschwitz and other camps to kill thousands at a time. The Nazis attempted to conceal the genocide, destroying records, cremating bodies, and dismantling camps as the Allies advanced. Despite the risks, resistance movements emerged. In the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Jewish fighters held off German forces for nearly a month. Partisan fighters in Eastern Europe disrupted Nazi operations and rescued escapees. Individuals like Oskar Schindler, Raoul Wallenberg, and Irena Sendler saved thousands by hiding Jews or falsifying documents. Entire nations, such as Denmark, helped evacuate their Jewish populations to safety. As Allied forces advanced in 1944 to 1945, they liberated concentration and death camps, uncovering the full scale of the genocide. Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz, and others revealed mass graves, starving prisoners, and horrific conditions. The world was shocked by photographic evidence and survivor testimony. After the war, the Nuremberg trials prosecuted leading Nazis for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, a term first coined during this period. The Holocaust was not an isolated atrocity, but a chilling example of what happens when hatred is institutionalized and human life is devalued. It stands as a permanent reminder of the need to confront racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia, the importance of education, human rights, and moral vigilance, the responsibility to remember and honor the victims. With over 6 million Jews and millions of other innocents murdered, the Holocaust remains one of the most studied and commemorated genocides in human history. Never again is not just a phrase, it is a warning, a call to action, and a sacred promise. Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought between June 4th and 7th, 1942, was a pivotal naval engagement in the Pacific theater of World War II. Just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy dealt a decisive blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy, halting Japanese expansion and shifting the balance of power in the Pacific. Japan aimed to lure American forces into a trap by attacking Midway Atoll, hoping to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers. However, American cryptographers had broken Japanese codes and knew the attack was coming. Under the command of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the U.S. Navy prepared an ambush of its own. During the battle, U.S. aircraft from carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown launched attacks on the Japanese fleet. In a series of dramatic strikes, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, which had all participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. The U.S. lost the USS Yorktown, but emerged strategically victorious. The Battle of Midway marked the turning point in the Pacific War. Japan lost its offensive momentum, along with many skilled pilots and irreplaceable ships. From that point forward, the U.S. and its allies would take the initiative, launching a steady campaign of island hopping toward Japan. The Battle of El Alamein, fought in October-November 1942, was a major turning point in the North African campaign of World War II. It marked the beginning of the end for Axis forces in Africa and was the first major offensive victory for the Western Allies against Nazi Germany. Located in Egypt, near the town of El Alamein, the battle pitted the British 8th Army, commanded by General Bernard Montgomery, against the German-Italian Panzer Army, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox. Rommel had advanced deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, a vital Allied supply route. Montgomery launched a well-planned offensive on October 23, 1942, using superior manpower, tanks, and air support. The Allies employed a massive artillery barrage, followed by a series of coordinated infantry and armored attacks. Despite fierce resistance, the Axis lines were eventually broken. By November 4th, Rommel's forces were in retreat. The victory at El Alamein boosted Allied morale and halted Axis ambitions in the Middle East and Africa. It paved the way for Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, and eventually led to the Axis surrender in Tunisia in 1943. As British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously said, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Battle of Stalingrad, winter 1942-43. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, was one of the most brutal and decisive battles of World War II. It marked a major turning point on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union halted and then reversed the advance of Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, aiming to conquer the Soviet Union. In 1942, he targeted the city of Stalingrad, now Volgograd, a vital industrial hub on the Volga River, and a symbolic prize because it bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Hitler ordered his troops to take the city at any cost. The battle became a grinding, street-by-street struggle with horrific casualties on both sides. As winter set in, the Soviet Red Army, under General Georgy Zhukov, launched Operation Uranus in November 1942, encircling the German Sixth Army led by General Friedrich Paulus. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, the German troops endured starvation, freezing temperatures, and relentless Soviet attacks. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Over 300,000 Axis soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Stalingrad was a devastating defeat for Hitler and marked the beginning of a massive Soviet push westward. The battle shattered the myth of German invincibility and turned the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. The years 1944 and 1945 marked the final phase of World War II, as the Allied forces launched a series of decisive offensives that broke the back of the Axis powers. With momentum gained from victories in North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front, the Allies struck hard on both the Western and Eastern fronts, leading to the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. On June 6, 1944, the Western Allies launched D-Day, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, landing on the beaches of Normandy, France. This opened a Western front and allowed Allied forces to begin liberating Western Europe from Nazi control. Paris was liberated by August, and Allied armies pushed toward Germany. Meanwhile, the Soviet Red Army, advancing from the east, launched massive offensives such as Operation Bagration, destroying German Army Group Center and liberating Eastern Europe, including Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans. The Soviets eventually reached Berlin in April 19. As the Allies closed in, the Third Reich crumbled. Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945, and Germany unconditionally surrendered on May 7, 1945, marking victory in Europe, VE Day on May 8. In the Pacific, the United States captured key islands through island-hopping campaigns, including Iwo Jima and Okinawa, bringing them closer to Japan. The war ended after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japan to surrender on August 15th, formally on September 2nd, 1945. The Allied victories of 1944–45 ended the most destructive war in history, dismantled fascist regimes, and set the stage for the post-war world order, including the founding of the United Nations and the Cold War division of Europe. By mid-1945, World War II in Europe had ended, but the Pacific War against Japan continued with fierce resistance. Despite devastating defeats, including the loss of the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Imperial Japan refused to surrender, preparing instead for a costly fight to the death on home soil. Facing the prospect of massive Allied casualties from a land invasion, the United States turned to a new, secret weapon, the atomic bomb. Developed under the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb represented an unprecedented level of destructive power. On August 6, 1945, a US B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on the city of Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands and leveling the city. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The bombings caused over 200,000 deaths, either instantly or from radiation exposure. Combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan and the invasion of Manchuria. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender, marking Victory over Japan Day, VJ Day. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, officially ending World War II. The use of atomic bombs remains controversial, sparking moral, military, and political debates. However, it undeniably hastened the end of the war, avoiding a prolonged invasion and reshaping the world with the dawn of the nuclear age. Aftermath and the formation of the United Nations. The devastation of World War II demanded new global governance. United Nations, 1945, established to promote peace and cooperation. Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi war crimes. Japan occupied by US. New democratic constitution. Europe lay in ruins. Refugees, orphans, and famine were widespread. Geopolitical consequences and the Cold War. USA and USSR emerged as superpowers. Ideological division led to the Cold War. Germany divided into East Soviet and West Allied. Iron Curtain descended across Europe. NATO versus Warsaw Pact rivalry defined global politics. Decolonization accelerated in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Memory, monuments, and historical lessons. Memorials across the world honor the fallen. Holocaust remembrance is a moral imperative. World War II serves as a lesson on the dangers of totalitarianism, racism and xenophobia, appeasement of aggression. Education and remembrance prevent history from repeating. A war that changed the world. World War II was not merely a military conflict. It was a global catastrophe that shaped the 20th century. It led to unimaginable suffering, the loss of millions, and the destruction of entire cities. But it also gave rise to the modern world order, the United Nations, and new movements for human rights and decolonization. Its legacy continues to inform global relations, military policy, and the collective memory of nations. The war teaches us not only about destruction, but about resilience, unity, and the need for constant vigilance in preserving peace.